Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Introduction to Finding Grants. My name is Elizabeth Sabella, and I'm a program specialist in our New York Learning Center for Candid. And I'll be supporting today's webinar by managing polls as well as collecting questions that you ask along the way and posing them during our brief Q&A at the end. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, we do want to share with you that we are celebrating our anniversary of becoming Candid. Last year, Foundation Center and GuideStar joined forces to form our new organization, and we are very, very excited for the work that is ahead of us. Every year, millions of nonprofits spend trillions of dollars around the world. Candid finds out where that money comes from, where it goes, and why it matters. We believe that an effective social sector is critical for a thriving society, and we believe in the importance of solutions for the sector, by the sector. Through research, collaboration, and training, Candid connects people who want to change the world with the resources they need to do it. We also want to say thank you for being part of Candid's learning community. With the evolving COVID-19 crisis, we know it's a challenging time for everyone. So to prioritize the safety and health of our communities during these times, we are shifting many of our in-person programs to online formats. You can learn more about what Candid is doing through this link that I'll provide in the chat shortly, and do keep an eye on our training calendar as we will be offering more virtual sessions coming up soon. At this point, I would like to introduce my colleague, Chris Bunting, so they can display their presentation. And as they take the reins, I will go ahead and introduce them. So Chris is actually our curriculum design manager here at Candid, overseeing many of the courses like today's, and designing new curriculum that we think nonprofit professionals need to continue their professional development process. With that, I'll hand it over to Chris to take us through the presentation.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Elizabeth, and thank you to all of you who are joining us live today and to those of you who will be watching the recording later. As Elizabeth mentioned, I definitely think about the trainings we do here at Candid every single day, and I want them to be engaging and then useful for you, and this training is no different. We've designed it to be practically useful for you to walk away with skills that you can use and apply as you look for grants and think about your funding. So without further ado, I just want to start today's presentation by telling you what you're going to get out of it. So by the end of your time with us, you should be able to do a few things. One, list different types of foundations. So as you may already be aware of, there are different types, and we'll go over those different types and those different motivations that each foundation type may have. So after today, you'll be able to explain various funders' motivations for giving grants. You'll be prepared to prove your organization's credibility with a funder lens, so understanding what they're looking for. We'll also walk you through how to research potential funders and different ways you can go about doing that, and also how to plan your initial approach to a funder. So that's a roadmap of where we're headed. And the way this training is set up is to walk you through the 10 most important things you need to know about finding grants. So let's go through list 1 through 10. So biggest one right off top is that you can't survive on grants alone. Many people think that all they need to do is get a few big grants to support their nonprofit organization, but it's important to know that you definitely cannot survive on grants alone. So I actually wanted to start pretty early today with asking you a question, and Elizabeth has a poll that goes with this question of what do you think is the biggest source of private contributions to nonprofits, foundations or individuals?
And an overwhelming amount of folks who participated selected individuals. Are they right, Chris, or is it a trick question? What are your thoughts?
They are absolutely right. So we have some data here from Giving USA that totally drives home that point that many of you already know, that individuals are absolutely one of the leading private sources of contribution. So we can see here 68% of private contributions come from individuals, and then we can also really add another 9% coming out of bequests, which are also coming from individuals. So absolutely, when you are thinking about your funding stream, we want you to think not only about finding grants as a potential resource, but certainly including individual contributions as part of that. And so definitely just one of the key takeaways to drive home is that individuals are a key resource for nonprofits when you're thinking about your funding. And therefore, although foundation giving may be one component of your overall grant seeking strategy, you can't depend solely on foundations. And so I recommend our Introduction to Fundraising Planning course as a resource that will really walk through how to plan out what your particular nonprofit's funding stream should look like. So I'm sure already a portion comes from individuals, what your plan is for receiving funding from other sources as well. And I also highlight this point early because I mentioned that we're going to be talking about proving your credibility to funders and to foundations. And often one of the things that funders are looking for is a sustainable revenue stream on your nonprofit's part. So they don't want to be giving grants that wholly sustain an organization. They want to be part of your revenue pie, and they want to see that you already have investment from your community. So that's another reason to be really thinking about your fundraising planning as a whole. So again, intro to fundraising planning to learn more there. Another thing to know, and we'll get into this a little bit more, is that even within this foundations piece, many people often think, well, when you're talking about foundations, you're talking about big foundations that are in the news often, like the Gates Foundation or the Ford Foundation, for example. But what we're going to get into is also that many, many, many foundations are small, and most grants come from small, local, or regionally based foundations that you probably have never heard of. And those grants are in smaller amounts than maybe, for example, the Gates Foundation gives out on average. So just wanted to highlight that as well as you're thinking about this foundations piece of the pie. Also really thinking about the fact that there may be foundations out there that you aren't yet aware of. And of course, I'm sure that's one of the reasons that brought you here today. And I see that we already have the intro to fundraising planning linked in the chat. So thank you, Elizabeth, for that. So we can continue on here now and really speak to the fact that not all foundations are alike. So foundation insiders will often say, if you know one foundation, you know one foundation. What that means is that foundations come in varying sizes, interests, and motivations. So another thing that we really want to start this class with is walking you through the different types of foundations that exist. So as you're researching potential funders, you can get a sense of what kind of foundation you're looking at in a particular moment. So there are three main types of private foundations. And of course, you see them on my screen here: independent, company-sponsored, and operating. So I want to walk you through what each of these mean. So independent or private foundation are grant-making organizations whose funds are generally derived from an individual, a group of individuals, or a family, and often include the family name. So this includes some of the largest foundations that may come to mind when you first think of the word foundation, like Gates, Ford, Kellogg, and MacArthur. But also know that the vast majority of independent, aka private foundations, are very small foundations, many of which are referred to as quote unquote family foundations because of the high degree of family involvement. And many of these small family foundations don't have staff, which is a reason that some only accept applications by invitation only. So this is an important thing for you to know about independent foundations, and they're very likely to come up as you're searching for grants, is that you may be encountering foundations that are only run by a small family, and they may get together quarterly and look at what grants they are preparing to make for that year, and then decide where those grants will go. And so knowing that, you also know that relationship building is going to be a key part of engaging foundations, especially these smaller foundations. So especially if they're only accepting applications by invitation, you'll need to get to know folks who are connected to them in order to apply for their grants. So just flagging that for independent private foundations. Another type, second bullet on my screen, company-sponsored foundations, also referred to as corporate foundations, are also a type of private foundation, and their grant funds are derived from contributions of a for-profit business. So a company-sponsored foundation may retain close ties with the donor company, but it is an independent organization with its own endowment and board of directors, and is subject to the same rules and regulations as private foundations generally. An example of this is the Home Depot Foundation. They give out grants on an annual basis, and while they have Home Depot in their name, they are separate from the company itself. One other type of private foundation, the third bullet on my screen here, that works a little differently is the operating foundation. An operating foundation may award some grants, but the total is generally small relative to the funds used for the foundation's own programs. So common examples there of operating foundations could be your local zoo or museum, for example. So independent, company-sponsored, operating, three big types of private foundations, and each very different animal. Another thing that you should know is that foundations must give money away. Private foundations are regulated by the IRS. And in order to count as a private foundation under IRS rules, they are required to give away a minimum of 5% of their prior year's assets, which can be averaged out over a few years. Now, because of that, they have to annually report to the IRS who they've given grants to and how much by submitting a 990-PF. PF stands for Private Foundation, a 990-PF form. Now, this is also where we get a lot of our information at Candid for Foundation Directory Online, our online database for grant searching, and I'll speak to that a little bit later, as well as other websites that we have here at Candid that are driven by data that has been reported by foundations. So again, key takeaway here is foundations must give money away, and they must be transparent about who they've given that money to, which is good news for you because you can research who those foundations have given money to. Now, I also want you to be aware of a few other types of grant makers that exist in addition to private foundations. So you've already seen that some corporations can set up company-sponsored foundations. Others give directly through what are known as direct corporate giving programs, which are grant-making programs established and administered within a profit-making company. So direct corporate giving programs operate within the company itself. So unlike corporate foundations, they're not a separate entity from the corporation, and their annual grants totals are generally directly related to companies' current profits. And for more information on corporate giving, I recommend one of our other free introductory courses, Introduction to Corporate Giving, which goes into corporate giving in much more depth and will give you really a sense of that world. But that's an introduction there. We've got corporate foundations and direct corporate giving programs. Last but not least, as you see on my slide, are grant-making public charities. Now, grant-making public charities, also known as public foundations, are usually supported substantially by contributions from individuals, corporations, and foundations, just like other nonprofits. And they receive funds from a variety of sources instead of a single source like private foundations. Some examples of public charities are community foundations. Community foundations are public charities that make grants for charitable purposes in a specific community or region. So many community foundations are geographically oriented. One, for example, is the Brooklyn Community Foundation. They give out grants to nonprofits and for projects within New York City's borough of Brooklyn. And there are community foundations across the country within the US. So that's definitely one. And these community foundations are often a great source if you're a smaller nonprofit. Get to know your local community foundation because they're often one of the first foundations to give to newer nonprofits. So definitely flagging community foundations under that umbrella of grant-making public charities. Also under the umbrella of grant-making public charities, you'll find population or issue-oriented foundations. So examples there are the Global Fund for Women or the Michael J. Fox Foundation for Parkinson's Research. Those are examples of population or issue-oriented foundations. So again, if you're working on a certain issue, you'll probably want to get a sense for what foundations may be funding within that issue. Now, a piece I promised you earlier was to speak to funder motivations. And funder motivations vary by funder type. So as we get into funder motivations, I want to kind of walk through this piece by piece and really ask you to, I showed it on the screen for just a moment, but we're going to start with private foundations. So if you think back to private foundations, these are often small families who are getting together to determine where to give, or maybe the bigger names that you're familiar with like Gates or Ford or MacArthur. And so before I show the answer on screen, I kind of want to take a moment for you to think about what would these private foundations' motivations be? What is driving their work? And the answer is that they set certain goals for their work. So generally, when you're looking at private foundations, you want to research what their priorities are. They are generally stated, or you can certainly research them as you're networking to get to know that particular foundation. They want to fulfill certain philanthropic goals and interests while supporting a variety of issues through an objective process. So they want to get to know who's doing the work on the ground on the issues that they care about and fund that work. Then we have corporate foundations. As we can imagine, one thing that corporations are thinking about is their position within the market, what people think of them. So often when corporations are thinking about what sort of projects, what sort of work they want to fund, you can imagine that it's often tied to branding, visibility, and corporate social responsibility. Again, we get into this a lot more in our Introduction to Corporate Giving course, but flagging it here. And we're really flagging these different funder motivations so that when you're approaching different funders, you're thinking about what perspective they're coming to the work with. Last, grant-making public charities. Remember that grant-making public charities, one of the types of foundations under this bucket are community foundations, often community foundations in a particular geographic area. So grant-making public charities typically want to make an impact in designated communities or regions, or focus on specific population groups or issue areas. So really the takeaway from this slide is as you're getting to know a foundation and as you're getting a sense of what type of foundation it is, you're going to be thinking about what their priorities are and how your work may relate to their priorities and their motivations. And this really gets to an important tip, number 4, that grant writing is never about the need of your organization. So as you may very well already know, grant seeking is a very competitive process. And when approaching funders for support, you have to prove to them that you're a credible nonprofit organization with the capacity to carry out a well-planned idea, purpose, or project. So you have to show that this isn't just about the need of your organization, but the people you're serving and the impact that it will make. So when funders are going to be reading your grant proposals or getting to know you as a potential uh, organization that they would fund, they're going to be thinking about how is what you're asking for going to change lives? How is what you're doing going to make an impact in your community? Um, for example, if you're asking for money to renovate a building or to hire new staff, what difference will that make in your community and to the people you serve? How will the funding that you're seeking help you achieve or advance your mission and make the world a better place? So that's really, and we'll speak to this also in our Introduction to Proposal Writing course. This is where we get even more into grant writing, but I think it's really important to plant the seed that when you're researching, when you're thinking about approaching a foundation, even before you get to the writing phase, you are really thinking about how you're creating relationships with these funders that are about the way that you're going to make an impact in the world, not about your particular organization's need, which I'm sure you're all already thinking about. It's what got you into the work. So thinking about credibility, what are some things that a funder is going to ask to determine whether you're credible? There's a few, but actually I want to take a pause here, and before I go through my bullet point list, I'm going to ask Elizabeth to help me make this a little more interactive and invite you in chat. What are some things that you think funders are going to look for when they are assessing whether you are a credible nonprofit to fund?
So we'll give everyone a moment to start typing and submitting through that chat function. And we have some early submissions from folks stating perhaps an operating budget, sustainability and transparency from your organization. They want to know what your mission is, what your past projects or proposals have been, perhaps having a seal of transparency, lots of statistics, your IRS status, knowing who your past funders have been, as well as a track record and experience and expertise on the issue that you're bringing forth. But definitely a lot of sustainability, success, and statistics that continue to come in through the chat. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, everyone. Yeah, so absolutely. I think sustainability, statistics around impact, proving your credibility over time, these are perfect. Absolutely. These are all in great takeaways. And thank you for mentioning the GuideStar seal there. That is a way that you can actually demonstrate information about your nonprofit, including your nonprofit's financial information online for free. So I'll get to that towards the end of our presentation as well. So that's a great plug there. But absolutely, credibility. I think sustainability, thank you for flagging that several times, and thinking about your impact. So first question that funders are just going to want to determine whether they're even going to move forward with considering funding you is for IRS rules, foundations generally should be giving money to legal nonprofits. So often one of their first questions is, are you a legal nonprofit? And they're going to look for obviously a yes answer to that. And so that is kind of step one that they're going to check off. The next thing to think about is, as we were exploring earlier, does your mission, does your work match the funder's focus area? So this is where your research is going to be really important, because you're going to want to be approaching funders who are interested in the work that you do, and you're going to want to demonstrate that you've researched their interests so that you are approaching them kind of in an informed way. So that's definitely another thing they look at earlier. Remember that private foundations often articulate what the issues and areas are that they want to fund. So that matchmaking process and thinking about that fit is really, really important. Another thing they're looking for is, do you have strong leadership? So for example, some of these funders very well may also be doing work in the community on your issue area? Do they know your executive director? Maybe that's a connection there, for example. Is your leadership, are they leading on the issues that you're working on? So do you have strong leadership? Certainly one there. I think one that several people already said in the chat and that Elizabeth highlighted is the impact that you're making. Do you have data on that impact? Can you show, hey, when we worked in our community over the past 5 years, this was the measurable impact, the measurable difference that we made. This is definitely something often funders are looking for. So do you provide high quality programs that meet a real need in the community? So you're going to be talking with them about the need in the community, demonstrating that that need exists in the community in your proposal, in your letter of inquiry, and you're also going to be demonstrating that your programs are of high quality and that you have impact measurements that show that difference. And last but not least, another one that people mentioned was sustainability and finances. Do you have strong organizational and financial infrastructure? This is definitely another thing that funders are looking for. They want to be funding organizations that are going to exist in 5 years and continue doing work beyond the grant. So that's another thing. Funders are thinking about their grants as an investment. So they want to see that you have a strong leadership, strong organizational and financial infrastructure. So absolutely. All right, let's go on to tip 5. Do your homework first. This is incredibly important. And what do I mean by do your homework first? It means never approach a grant maker unprepared. Kind of think about this as if you are on a job hunt and you have been contacted for an interview. You want to show up to that interview showing that you've done some homework about why you want to work at that particular organization, right? Similar approach here. You want to do your homework first, really identify the funders, the grant makers who care about the need in your community, care about the issue that you're working on, and want to fund that sort of work. So homework is key. So when seeking a grant, you must know as much as you possibly can about that particular foundation that you plan to approach before you approach them. This research, this homework is key. And I'll speak to different ways that you can do that a little later in the presentation. But let's get on to a very related point that the one-size-fits-all approach does not work. So related to doing your homework, you also need to tailor your approach to each funder. So to be effective at finding grants, you're going to need to create an individual strategy for each potential funder and tailor your letter of inquiry and your proposal around who you are approaching and why. I think the job search parallel carries over here, right? You wouldn't want to send the exact same cover letter to 50 different organizations that you might want to work for and expect to get a very robust response, right? You're much more likely to get a good response if your approach is tailored to their particular interests. All right, to get the grant, you have to find the right match. And so that's why research is the most essential part of grant seeking. So when we're thinking about finding grants, really we're thinking about research before we ever get anywhere near submitting a grant proposal. What you're looking to establish at the research phase is a match between the mission and activities of your nonprofit organization and the philanthropic mission and funding interests of the foundation that you are approaching. So the ultimate goal of this match is to create a partnership between your organization and the funder that can help to solve problems and address issues that you both care about. And I'm dying to know what some of those issues are, but for sake of time, I'll keep going, but feel free to share with Elizabeth in the chat some of the things you're working on, and we can explore those potentially as examples later in this training. And what I want you to know is that with Candid's Foundation Directory Online, you can create a customized grant search based on answering 3 questions. So these 3 questions are, who funds in my area of interest and the population I serve? Who funds in my geographic region? And who will provide the support I need? So it's really the first 2 here. So if you can outline your area of interest, what issue are you working on? Who do you serve? What population do you serve? And where are you working? Your geographic region. You can search within Foundation Directory Online to find funders who have given grants within that issue area, within that geography related to the population that you serve. And really the issue area and geography are the first 2 that you can set up a search about. So for example, if you run a homeless shelter in Atlanta, Georgia, or you're an arts organization in Chicago, you can run a search in Foundation Directory Online based on that criteria and see information about grant makers who have given to work like yours. So that is that matchmaking is really key to get the grant. To approach the right grant maker, you really want to find the grant makers who care about your issue, your population that you're serving in your area. And you also need to think about asking for the right amount. So when you're doing your research, another thing you're going to be thinking about is, has the grant maker funded organizations like yours? And how much money should you ask for? So you'll get a better idea of a funder's potential interest in you if you can determine that it is given to organizations or programs similar to yours in the past. Again, something that you can research in Foundation Directory Online. I will also plug a course that goes into Foundation Directory Online in much more detail. That's our Introduction to Foundation Directory Online course. And I'm sure that Elizabeth will pop that in the chat as well. And know that that is a course that gives you a full tour of Intro to Foundation Directory Online. And so, but one is ask for the right amount and the way to do that is you can take a look at grant lists that grant makers have made and see how much they actually gave to a particular organization or to a particular project in a particular year. So when you're doing your research, you can actually see, oh, they gave $5,000 to my peer organization in a different city last year, for example. So that's also going to give you an indication of how much to ask for, because ultimately you do hope to submit a letter of inquiry with a concrete ask, to submit a grant proposal with a concrete ask. And so your research can help you identify what that ask could be. Now, another thing to know is that you don't need to know someone to get a grant, but it can help you get your foot in the door. So this is really where networking is important. I mentioned at the beginning of our time together that many private foundations are small. They may only be a set of family members that want to give back to their community, and they meet on, a few times a year to determine who they're going to give to. They don't have a lot of capacity to accept thousands of applications. So networking is often a way to help you get your foot in the door here. But you may be saying to yourself, oh, well, that's nice, Chris. I don't know a bunch of rich people who are, sitting around with their family foundations with their checkbook open. I totally get it. So I want to talk to you a little bit about where to find these connections and how to think this through, because it is important. So what are some ways that you can do this? How can you find these connections? One is through your board members or donors. Your board members are resources when it comes to your foundation funding research, because you can get a sense of who is, for example, who are program officers at foundations, who are on boards of foundations, and you can bring those lists to your own board members and say, hey, do you know any of these people? Maybe they can help you get a connection there. Also, organizational partners. you're doing the work on the issues that matter. You're doing the work in your communities, and you already have people who you are networking with, who you know. You can network with those organizational partners and have a conversation with them about funders that you are considering approaching, considering creating relationships with. Also, don't forget your current funders. Funders know each other. Funders talk to each other about who they're funding, what nonprofits they're working with, what nonprofits they're excited about. So if you already have a current funder, sometimes as I mentioned earlier, your community foundation may be your first funder in the grant maker world. They may know other funders likely to be interested in you, or you may be able to go to them and say, hey, I'm really thinking about approaching X funder. Do you know anyone there? Do you have any tips on how I might be able to build that relationship? And also check your LinkedIn network. So once you get a sense of who's at that foundation, who's on their board, you can see if you have any connections within LinkedIn. So another great tool. So it's really useful to think about networking and ways that you can create networks, create meetings, create conversations before you submit an actual proposal. Because as you can imagine, for one, you're likely to get more consideration if you've made connections with people at that foundation who are already excited about your work. And also, those connections could also give you some guidance or some helpful information to put in the proposal. For example, they might be able to tell you more about the specific kinds of projects or types of funding they may be interested, what the best time to apply or to reach out may be. Also a tip on board members, you want to make sure that you are the one building the relationship and not your board member, because the contact will leave with the board member and you don't want that to happen. So board members can be great for making introductions, but of course, keep in mind that you'll also want to build those relationships yourself. And last but not least, tip number 10, the proposal is typically not the first thing a foundation wants. So along those lines, know that you can use Foundation Directory online to find application deadlines and requirements, as well as how the funder may prefer the initial approach. Many do not want the full proposal off bat, and they'll typically tell you what they do want. So typically, the first thing foundations want is not the grant proposal, not the full grant proposal. Typically, the first thing they want is a letter of intent, also known as a letter of inquiry, or abbreviated LOI as the initial approach. So letter of intent, letter of inquiry, LOI, they all mean the same thing. And what an LOI is usually a 2-page mini version of your proposal. And I will plug right now, our GrantSpace website does include some sample LOIs, so you can get a sense of what that looks like, as well as some guidance on content for your LOIs. So in making your initial approach, we have a few tips for you. So I'll just speak to those very briefly. Some tips for the initial approach. If it's acceptable, try to make a phone call. So to connect to someone, make sure that you know who you're trying to reach out to, that you've already done your homework before you make that telephone call, so that you can make the case when you're on that call of why your organization is an appropriate fit for the funder that you're reaching out to. And before you even make that telephone call, have your full proposal written before you pick up the phone or submit anything in writing. So the goal of the initial approach is to gauge a funder's interest in what you'll be asking for and see if they'd like for you to submit a full proposal. So with this in mind, you want to have the bulk of your proposal already written, so when you get the green light, you can easily tailor it to meet the funder's specific requests and send it out as soon as possible. So for more information on how to write a proposal, I strongly suggest our Introduction to Proposal Writing class as a great other free resource. So that will really walk you through the proposal. So again, before you even pick up the telephone, before you submit anything in writing, you're going to draft a base proposal for the project that you want funded, and then you'll be able to tailor it for each funder. So again, going back to that job search function, you want to, in your job search, you often have a cover letter. It's a basic cover letter, and then you tailor it for each job that you're applying for. Same thing goes here. You'll have a base grant proposal, and then you'll tailor it for each funder. So back to the phone call. Try to make a telephone call unless in your research you find that they say no phone calls, please. So make sure that you research whether, if acceptable, so make sure it is acceptable, then you can make the call. So when you're given a choice for the initial approach to the potential funder, try to use the most personal approach. It's better for building the relationship. By all means, definitely try not to initiate the relationship by email, as that could be very impersonal, especially when you're already trying to introduce yourself to a funder for the first time. When making a phone call or having a face-to-face meeting with the funder, you want to have the full proposal already written with an executive summary and some brief talking points. And then if they're interested, they'll probably have some questions about your project, and you want to be prepared to answer them. So again, know that that base proposal that you're drafting is also a way for you to draft the talking points and answers to questions that you're likely to get. So all the more reason to have that base proposal drafted, know what you're asking for, know what the need is that you're meeting, how you're proving the impact that you're making. And again, for much, much more on this, our Intro to Proposal Writing course is a great next step. Also, when you're reaching out to people, of course, know who they are and why you're reaching out to them. This is another part of doing your homework first. Who are you calling? Why are you calling them? Why are you interested in talking to them specifically? Why are you interested in their organization? And the last 2 points here on screen, keep the conversation brief and to the point. That I think speaks for itself, but we all are incredibly busy. So making sure that we are very efficient, very focused with the time that we're asking people to invest in us. And try to utilize context when you have them. So of course, the idea of warm calling versus cold calling comes into this sort of thing too. If you can make a warm call where you've already had an introduction or a face-to-face meeting where someone has connected the two of you, always better than a cold call or a cold ask. So those are the top 10 things we want you to know as you're thinking about finding grants. I know that's a lot of information, so I always want to close out trainings by reinforcing some key takeaways. So what are some key takeaways that you're going to want to do? One, you're going to want to plan to prove that you are a credible nonprofit and have evidence to back that up. Two, you're going to do your research to find the right fit. I feel like I'm probably overstating this, but I really don't think it can be overstated that a key part of this process is that you'll be researching and finding funders who are interested in the sort of work that you do, the sort of impact you're looking to make, and the work that you're doing, potentially in a certain geography. And always focus on the funder's motivations and interests. Show what's in it for them. And I think this goes for general kind of human communication, right? You just don't want to be talking about me, me, me. If you really want to engage someone, you want to be getting to know them, and you want to be thinking about this as a partnership and how you are helping each other get to the impact that you want to make in the world. And fourth, finally, last but not least, be prepared. Know who you're approaching and why they're a good fit. So those are some key takeaways for you. I think another piece that I just want to speak to a little bit more that you very well may be hungry for is wow, Chris, this was all really great. Now I know some really key takeaways, but how do I do it? I'm sure you are screaming into the phone that exact question. So let's talk about exactly how do you do these things. There are a few different Candid provided resources that I want to highlight for you that will help you do this research. The first one is Foundation Directory Online. Again, our Introduction to Foundation Directory Online course goes into this in much more depth than I will today. So if you want a deep dive or at least a more than just a few minute dive into Foundation Directory Online, I highly recommend that course. But just very briefly, I want to highlight that in Foundation Directory Online, you can search for funders who have funded work like yours. So I mentioned earlier that you can search by the work that you do. So let's say I'm a homeless shelter in Atlanta. I mentioned that earlier. I can type that directly into the search box, click search, and then it will run a search for me with terms that match my search. So I can find 456 grant makers that have funded work on homelessness in Atlanta, 3,000 grants associated with it, and 96 recipients. So what this will allow me to do is then I can dig into, find out more information about these grant makers and the work that they've funded. So first I'll find the grant makers, then I'll find grants, and I'll find recipients who have done work in this area. Check out Foundation Directory Online or check out our Intro to Foundation Directory Online course for a lot more guidance on how you can dig into each one of these sections. For kind of simplicity's sake, I'm going to start just with briefly showing you, if you click on a grant maker within a particular search, you're going to learn more about that particular grant maker. So I can see that education, health, and human services, top 3 interests here for this community foundation. And I can also see the average size of their grants as well. So all useful information. And also on the left-hand side, you can find out, for example, about that grant maker's funding interests. So I talked earlier about the matchmaking that you need. The funding interests are super important for that. We also can recommend other funders to consider that are similar. You can find out more about applications. So I mentioned earlier, you should research their initial approach. You can find their initial approach here in that grant maker profile. Also networking, I was talking about that. Here's a way that you can actually network with people. You can see the officers and directors and also staff of funders that you're researching. So this is a great way for you to be researching potential connections and really thinking about that fit and researching that fit with funders. So this is all just a quick demo of our Foundation Directory Online product that Candid has. Know that you can individually subscribe to that product and run the search directly from your home or office. I recognize that that may not be something that you currently have, and so I want to highlight another option for you, which is our Funding Information Network. Our Funding Information Network is a network of libraries and capacity builders across the United States and even more broadly throughout the world, where you can go to access Foundation Directory Online for free. So next question that raises is, well, where are all these places? If you go to the Foundation Information Network page, you'll see Find Network Locations, and from there you're able to find the locations right there. Now we are recording this during the COVID-19 pandemic, and so many of these libraries or locations may be closed. If that is the case, I still encourage you to reach out to that location, let them know that you're interested in doing grant research and see what resources they may have available to you. So that is definitely a resource that I highly recommend. Now, there's a few other things for you to know. One is that we have our foundation landscapes at Candid, and foundation landscapes are individual websites where we combine multiple resources, including data visualization tools, original research, and more to illuminate critical issues in philanthropy so you can see where you stand. So actually, I want to pause again and ask a question via chat. And Elizabeth, maybe some answers already came in. What sort of issue areas are you working on? I welcome hearing about some in the chat.
Yeah, we've gotten a few come in. We definitely have a few folks who are doing arts and culture, other folks who are working with adult education and adults with special needs, many folks who are actually doing work abroad as well, and many, many, many more submissions coming in now, including childhood obesity, youth development, girls education, community gardens, substance recovery. So we definitely have an audience that spans the country and the globe as well as cause areas.
Amazing, amazing. Well, it's so gratifying to hear that you're all taking the time to be with us today and to hear about all of the great work you're doing. So, of course, I can't speak to all of those issue areas. Again, remember that in Foundation Directory Online, you can search and under advanced searches as well, search by subject area and geographic focus and population served. So for example, age groups, I heard youth a few times. That could definitely be an area that you search under, and subject area, you can search within arts and culture. So that's Foundation Directory Online. I want to highlight Foundation Landscapes because we have a range of landscapes that are publicly available through Candid that speak to work in different geographic areas. So for example, if you happen to be located in India or East Africa or Massachusetts here, you can see that we have landscapes where you can dig into funding and funders interested in work in that area. We also have landscapes related to different issue areas. So for example, funding the ocean is one. Or early childhood development in East Africa combines both geography and an issue area. So I will just click into funding the ocean. This is just an example of a landscape, just to show you a little bit about what you can find. Again, you can do this from anywhere. You can go to our landscape pages, and we have funding maps as well as resource centers, but I really want to focus on the funding map because that's what brought you with us today. To research funders and to research funding. So you can see on these landscapes where and how organizations around the world are doing work related, in this case, to work on the ocean. So we can, no pun intended on my part, but dive into the map. And then from there, you can start researching funders here. So I'll click Start Searching here. And what you'll see now that you've seen Foundation Directory Online is you can actually see in this list view that we're pulling from the same database, but specifically focusing only on funders who have done work on the ocean in this case. So let's say, for example, I am originally from Maryland, so I'll just say I am interested, let's say I'm a nonprofit in Maryland, the United States. I could find work grants that have been given by certain funders and to certain recipients in certain years, and I can dive into that. You can also dive deeper into funders and recipients working on this area. So just highlighting that briefly, and also a particular location that you have here are funds for coronavirus relief. This is a landscape that we have created, or a website that we specifically created based on our current moments, and know that you can also research further there. But without further ado, Elizabeth, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Christine, and thank you so much for just taking us through all of that material. I know it can be a lot to absorb, especially over a webinar, but do know that we do have our online librarian service. So right at the top of your screen there, I believe it's actually also on the bottom, you can find lots of help to get additional support for any questions that you have, if you want to get guidance on, how to do your searches, etc. With that, thank you everyone for joining us today. Chris and I are very happy that you were able to carve some time out of your day to spend with us when there's so many shifting priorities in this moment. I do want to let you know that you will receive a copy of the recording to view on your own time. You'll get that within the next 2 business days. It'll also include a link to the handouts that are available for today's session. And with that, we definitely hope that you keep in touch today. You can connect with us on social. Again, you can reach out to our online librarians who can help you with any of your funding research. Any last words of advice before we let folks go here, Chris?
I would say just remember you're also going to have a recording of this, and we have a lot of resources on GrantSpace. So as you're doing your research, I just recommend keeping our online librarians and keeping GrantSpace and .org in mind as a resource. We're definitely here to be of support. And just thank you for being with us today.
Thank you so much, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Stay well and stay safe.